Alrighty. Oh, I just remembered one thing. Let's move this back in here. 1 second, guys. We do some on-air productions here as we move our camera back in. Make it a little bit easier to see everything. Oops. I keep touching the wrong box. There we go. Alright, let's just move this down. There. Okay. Alright. So hopefully everybody's having a good day so far and everything's going all smooth for everybody. It's Good Friday for those in America, so for those who are in school, at least college, and oops. Hello everybody. I just realized I didn't unmute myself from that intro. So, hello, I'm Wyatt. I forgot that I disabled my webcam on the last stream, so it's not a breakdown with WB stream without some sort of technical difficulty. So hopefully we at least got our first technical difficulty out of the way early. But as I was just saying, hopefully everybody's had a good day or good last week or whatever from the time I streamed last. And for those who are college students or high school students in the United States, there is Good Friday this week. So the majority of people who are college students or what are going to have Good Friday off. So it's a little bit shorter of a school week. So I'm enjoying that aspect of it. We're also down to about, I think, 6 weeks left, if I'm thinking right, of school this semester. So that is even better. But, yeah. So today's stream is going to be basically a study stream, but it's over a political topic, and I've done at least one stream, and I think it's been 2 or 3 streams over voter ID requirements. Now that I think about it, it was one stream because one was about the voter IDs in particular, and one was about voter fraud, which was getting claimed against voter ID laws and whatnot. So it actually was just one stream over the particular voter ID laws. But I have a homework assignment due for this next Tuesday, not this Tuesday, but the next Tuesday, over voter ID laws in Texas, and over really one particular law that was made in 2012 for the 2014 election, and then in 2016 the Fifth Court of Appeals overturned the verdict that the former Texas governor signed, who was Rick Perry. So basically I'm going to be doing some, I guess you could say, investigative research, trying to answer the question that I have titled for today's stream, and figuring out what all details we need to know for this particular homework assignment, and if it's disenfranchising or not, because it is ultimately the question we have to answer for the paper. There's several other components to it and whatnot, but ultimately that is the main answer. So I'm going to go ahead and start up the music again, and feel free to let me know if it's a little bit too loud or if you can't hear me in particular as we start talking about some of the assignments here and information, and just try to figure out this question for the homework assignment and for the topic. As I did with my previous stream, we kind of talked over voter ID laws being ultimately discriminatory or not, and it's hard to ultimately tell exactly where you can stand on this issue, because there's definitely a lot of information out there that suggests that voter ID laws are decently discriminatory for minority voters and minority peoples in general. The whole idea being that fewer minorities have access or the ability or the finances or the motivation or whatever you want ultimately to say to find an ID. So because of that, voter ID laws that Texas has done and Georgia and a few other states have done have been claimed to be discriminatory, and that's kind of being a nice way of saying it. And some have called it outright racist, given a few of the southern states' history, such as Texas, what this paper is going to be particularly about. So answering that question is fundamental to be able to come up with what I want for the questions. So we have here the paper, and I don't know why it decided to do this. Here we go. It's resizing a little bit. So we'll kind of scroll up here. So we have our writing assignment paper, and we have our 3 questions that are ultimately going to be the 3 paragraphs or 3 talking points or 3 questions that I have to answer. I do think that there's going to be a decent amount of information per each of these questions, because there's really a lot to talk about when you're mentioning the factors that we have to answer for discussing voter ID laws in general, and most importantly putting a focus on Texas in particular, because this is a government class focused on Texas. So kind of understanding the motivations of why this bill was made for the state of Texas, and the motives and the outcomes of this is going to be extremely important to be able to answer the questions that the professor wants answered for this essay. So I'm just going to go ahead and read kind of the question, and then we're going to read the 3 questions he wants us to answer. So it says here, in 2011, the Texas legislature passed a bill later signed into law by Governor Rick Perry that requires voters to show specific forms of photographic identification, like driver's license, state-issued identification cards, as proof of identity when voting on election day in an election. In the summer of 2016, the U.S. Fifth Court of Appeals found the law violates the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that is kind of the main prompt that he wants answered, and then he has given us 3 questions underneath for the particulars and for the pages or paragraphs that he wants to be discussed. So the first question here is, first, list and explain arguments in favor of the Texas voter identification law and similar laws passed in other states. Second, list and explain arguments against the Texas voter identification law and in favor of the decision by the U.S. Fifth Court of Appeals. And then the last question, take a position in favor of the law or in favor of ruling by the court, illustrating in detail why you favor the position that you are to do and why the other position is unconvincing. And then just some general ideas for how he wants the paper to be structured, and some generic kind of college structure, so we don't really ultimately have to get into those details to understand the fundamental questions that I have here. So I thought first we would pull up some articles that were being written at the time of this law being talked about and by the passing of the law. So these first articles are going to be 2011, 2012, 2013 based articles at the time that this law was being talked about, and ultimately this law being passed by the Texas legislature. And we will later see that the Texas legislature passed this law on party lines, meaning that all Republicans voted yes to this identification law and all Democrats voted no. But since Texas is a majority Republican in the legislature and really all upper chambers of government, the Republicans won out and the law got passed. And then, as we read a little bit ago, it would later be overturned. But we're just focused on the articles that were written at the time discussing this issue. So this is by the Texas Tribune, and we are going to have a decent amount of Texas Tribune articles throughout my research here. It states voter ID passes House after long emotional debate. After more than 11 hours of debate, 7 points of order, more than 60 amendments, and nearly as many heated exchanges, a mentally vanquished and emotionally exhausted Texas House preliminary approved the controversial voter ID bill late tonight. After more than 11 hours of debate, 7 points of order, more than 60 amendments, and nearly as many heated exchanges, a mentally vanquished and emotionally exhausted Texas House preliminary approved the controversial voter ID bill late tonight. The bills, SB 14, which will require that voters would present a form of approved photo identification to cast a ballot, was strictly passed along party lines, like I just said. Anyway, throughout the debate, Democrats opposed the bill that Governor Rick Perry designated as an emergency item. They tried and failed time and time again through amendments to loosen the strict voting requirements. State Representative Patricia Harless, Republican Spring, the bill's House sponsor, bore the brunt of the Democrats' frustration, but she and the Republican supporters of the measure dug in and projected even moderate proposals for change, with Republicans accounting for 101 of the 150 legislators in the House. The bill's approval was never in doubt. Republicans argued, as they have done for years, of working to pass the measure, that requiring photo identification is necessary to stop voter fraud, to restore integrity at the ballot box, and to increase voter confidence and turnout. Democrats countered that voter fraud at the polling place is a myth, and that if it occurs at all, it is through mail-in ballots, a problem that the bill would do nothing to address. Instead, they said requiring a photo ID will disenfranchise thousands of voters, including the elderly, minorities, and students. Democrats had some early access in an amendment by Representative Craig Eling, Democrat Galveston, to exempt those who lack voter ID due to natural disasters was approved. An amendment Representative Helen and Democrat DeSoto to allow those IDs are stolen to furnish an affidavit and police report to vote was also adopted. State Representative Naomi Gonzalez, Democrat of El Paso, passed an amendment that would make a photo ID issued by a recognized tribal organization acceptable. Gonzalez border district includes the Dorsor Pablo tribe. But most of the Democrats' other attempts to broaden the types of identification voters could use to cast ballots to create exemption for special cases were similarly rejected. Republicans had their own amendments, including one by Dennis Bonham, Republican, which eliminated a provision exempting seniors 70 or older from the requirements. In a rare move, the Democrats also challenged the constitutionality of the bill. They pointed to a section in the bill that would allow Texas to receive IDs free of charge. The Democrats asserted that the free ID provision would strip as much as $14 million from the Texas Mobility Fund. This account is funded largely with fees that DPS collects for issuing IDs. A point of order challenging the bill on those grounds was overruled. During the final stages of debate, about 9 hours after it began, State Representative Rafael Anchia offered an amendment that would prevent the bill from taking effect unless the state comptroller certified the fund would not be affected. It also failed. So that brings up a really interesting point towards the end of this article here, and that's talking about the cost of IDs. Because most of the time when people are discussing IDs that I hear a lot from, say, the left content creators, is the idea that these fees disenfranchise certain communities because they might not have the access or the ability to spend the 16, 20, whatever dollars it is to renew or to have a government issued ID. instead of paying for, say, food or water or something that is more fundamental to their everyday needs or to their needs at that moment as compared to who they are going to vote for. So there's a big argument from the left side of politics to make these voter IDs, if they have to be done, to be free of charge. So you would just you wouldn't have to pay for the ID, obviously, because that's what free means. But as this article was suggesting, I found it interesting that Democrats were ultimately going against that, at least from what the article suggested. Because of state budgetary reasons, but at the same time, that does make some sense compared to simply rejecting the whole idea of what is at hand. So we'll go to our next article here. No, we don't want this. Come on. Okay. Texas voter ID law goes into court. Well, this article may be out of place, but we'll go ahead and read it. Texas state officials federal court Monday. So right here is a important statistic. Texas is among 8 states to require official photo identification in an effort to stop what officials say is voter fraud. Opponents of the law say that disenfranchised poor minority and disabled voters, Obama administration officials have concluded there is little evidence of voter fraud in Texas, warranting legislative changes. Why is this dying? Yeah, it doesn't really say anything particularly new from what we have known before about voter ID stuff, so not particularly the most insightful, even though it did remind me of a couple of things that I could have towards the end of my paper, where I have to answer ultimately the question of this whole topic over if the voter ID laws are good or bad, about the impersonation, because I remember on the first stream I did in particular about voter ID, impersonation fraud was very minimum, but there's still impersonation fraud that exists, so there still is a percentage or a believed percentage of impersonation fraud that happens. So the idea of making elections as good as possible and as fair as possible is a good thing to ultimately have and a good thing to try to achieve. But ultimately you're arguing at what cost does that necessarily need to be achieved? Because if you're doing it just to prevent let's say, 3% of voter fraud that exists, but it prevents more than 3% of people from actually voting because of the bill, then ultimately are you doing more good or are you doing more good or are you doing more bad? And you can definitely see where there's many people approaching the idea of trying to prevent voter ID laws because of them targeting minorities. And there seems to be data to suggest that that could be the case. Hello, Mr. Code. I don't know what you're ultimately mad about with the WTF there on YouTube, but hopefully you're not mad at anything in particular going on in your day. It is a Monday, so I'm not exactly the most thrilled because Mondays are always rough, but let me know if the music's a little bit too loud or if the volume's too loud or anything like that, if you don't mind. This next one is about a Texas Tribune, and this was basically just mentioning what this idea means and what that could potentially do at the 2014, I believe it was 2014, or it was 2012. It was either 2012 or 2014 election. I believe it was 2014, and this law was going to get passed in 2012. So yes, it was the 2014 election. But this was an article talking about if those bills were to be passed that Rick Perry, the past governor, wanted to do, that it could really shape the election, and that's kind of what the article was talking about. Like I mentioned, these are articles written at the time around this law, and then we're going to get into some more updated articles and more of some scientific or academic statistics over if the voter ID laws were discriminatory or not. But before I just keep blabbering on, we'll read some from the Texas Tribune again. Day 24, the state's continuous voter ID legislation begins to take shape. The voter requirement does not take effect until 2012, but next month state agencies are scheduled to begin various outreach efforts designed to educate Texans about the legislation. That's another potential point to bring up, is the idea of once you change a law like this that ultimately affects who's going to end up voting or how voting is done, you have to make sure that the public is aware of this change. So I remember hearing a lot of times, and this was in a government class I took in community college, where she was mentioning the fact that voter ID laws are something that's detrimental, because when you do a voter ID law, you have to spend so much money educating the public on this change. And the amount of money you have to spend on marketing, so to speak, and educating the public is more than necessarily that should be done for something that doesn't really have much of an effect. So there's ultimately no need to have a voter ID law in place if you're not really preventing that much fraud and you're only making it more difficult just for the sake of making it more difficult, was kind of her argument. But she also brought up the factor of marketing and cost it takes for the government to change something as radical as changing the way someone goes to vote. Beginning in 2012, voters will be required to show a valid voter ID to cast a ballot. Governor Rick Perry designed the legislation, which passed as the Senate Bill 14 by State Senator Tory Frazier, as an emergency item. During the 2009 legislative voter ID came across during the final weeks of the 81st legislature, blah 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 blah, passed by the Republicans. Yes, we know that. The new measure means most Texans will have to show an allowed form of identification to vote in any local, state, or national election. These include a state-issued ID card or a driver's license, a military ID, or a concealed handgun license issued by the Department of Public Safety, a passport or state-issued election identification certificate. The latter is a free ID issued to a person who requests it specifically for the purpose of voting. Most of the bills passed in this previous session take effect next month, as do a number of provisions in the voter ID bill. The actual voter requirement, however, goes into effect in January after lawmakers decide the state should allot additional time to educate voters about the bill's requirements. So what happens next month? Several outreach and organizers, blah 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 blah. It's still unclear what happens after this, whether the state legislature passes a measure that affects voting or changes the mechanism by which a Texan casts a ballot. A provision of the Federal Voting Rights Act allows the U.S. Department of Justice or the federal courts to review the law. That process is pending. The Texas Secretary of State filed its request for pre-clearance with the Department of Justice last month, and a response is expected in September. If the department rules that the bill will not adversely affect voter turnout, opponents of the measure are likely to file legislation to halt the measure. So we kind of know the impact of what happened from this bill, because this was all the way back in 2011/2012, and we know that it got challenged in 2016 and got overturned in 2016, so we know some of the results based off of what happened here. But I thought that was interesting to read something from predicting the future of what would happen ultimately in 2012, and then ultimately what would be overturned later on in this process for voter IDs. We'll go to another Texas Tribune article because they talked a lot about this, and they're a good source for what's going on in the legislature in Texas. But this was comparing Texas to other states, because I was curious to know how harsh Texas was when compared to other states for voter ID registration, and who ultimately requires to have voter IDs, who doesn't require it. Just ultimately how more strict is Texas, or is Texas ultimately strict at all? That kind of whole concept for everything. So we will read from this article. Still don't know what he was mad about. Anyway, when Texas voters are asked to show a photo ID, turn this. Okay. When Texas voters are asked to show a photo ID at the polls in January, they will join voters in 29 states that have adopted voter identification requirements, but only 6 of which require photo identification. The legislature passed a controversial requirement during the regular session that ended in May. Because of the Texas history of racial discrimination, Section 5 of the Federal Voting Rights Act gives the U.S. Department of Justice or the federal courts the authority to review laws that would affect voter participation before they are enacted. Before the change in law, Texas voters could show a voter registration certificate or another document, such as a utility bill, that listed their name but didn't necessarily have to have a photo in it. Luis, staff attorney for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, said that the Texas Secretary of State sent the U.S. Department of Justice its petition for pre-clearance on July 25th. The agency could receive the department's report by late September. The state attorney general's office will likely not become involved in the process until the federal government challenges the legitimacy of the law's new requirements. I'm going to check something real quick here. Okay, so we're looking good on that. Alrighty. Good to know. Okay. Maybe the music was a little bit too loud. That's my only guess, really. But I turned that down, so it doesn't look like we're particularly in too much of a trouble here. But we'll continue on. The law in Texas didn't change easily. In 2009, the matter led to legislative meltdown that killed not only the voter ID measure, but hundreds of other bills, too. The issue divided Republicans and Democrats. Republicans said the stricter requirements would ensure integrity at the ballot box. Democrats said there was little to no voter fraud in Texas, and the bill would make it harder for minorities, the poor, and the elderly, and the disabled, those who are less likely to have driver's license to vote. The debate here mirrored the discussions of lawmakers in other states, said Jennifer Browser, senior fellow at National Conference of State Legislators, a nonpartisan group that monitors legislative bodies nationwide. Indiana and Georgia were among the first states to adopt voter ID laws in 2006 and 2007, respectively. After continuous partisan debates, one side says they are contracting voter fraud. The other says there is not enough widespread evidence to support these claims. So how does the voter ID law compare to other states? Only 6 other states like Texas have a strict photo requirement: Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Wisconsin, South Carolina, and Tennessee. 7 states, Alabama, Florida, Hawaii, Idaho, Louisiana, Michigan, and South Dakota, ask voters for photo ID, but still allow them to cast a ballot if they don't have a photo ID and can meet other specific criteria. 16 other states require voters to show some form of ID, though not necessarily with a photo. That would be like a utility bill, like we were mentioning before. Law put Texans in a group with Indiana and Georgia, which I would categorize as fairly strict, said Doug Chaplin, an elections expert at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Despite fears that the voter ID laws will lead to disenfranchisement, Chaplin said there is little to evidence that many voters actually lack ID. In the Indiana case, they made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. For example, opponents of the voter ID law were unable to produce a single individual who lacked the proper ID, Chaplin said. That is a interesting fact, if that is 100% true. I'll have to look at that claim to ultimately verify that as being true before I would have a fact like that or talk about that in my paper. So, but that is something to keep in my mind for potentially to use in my paper. Hans von Sparkowski, senior legal fellow at the Conservative Heritage Foundation, said other states that have passed voter ID laws have seen an increase in voter turnout and have not experienced the negative effects of those who oppose it had expected. Critics of the law, however, remain worried that the Texas law will discourage voting. I would say the Texas law would probably be on the bad side, said Nancy Abdul, senior staff counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. And amidst the types of voters, we view this as one of the many laws that are designed to decrease voter turnout. So there we got the article by the Texas Tribune there, and it had facts on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. So that is something to keep in mind. But I definitely would like to verify that one point made by the analysis of Indiana, that they couldn't come up with a single person. Because if the idea of these voter ID laws are not disenfranchising those who are going to go to vote. So in other words, if a voter ID law doesn't restrict the amount of people that show up in the ballot box and go ahead and vote, then anything to improve the election and make sure that there is less election fraud and overall a more better election would be something I think every American would want, because an accurate and fair election is what we want to have in America. But that's only if that claim is true in what's made with Indiana. And I would have to make sure that that is necessarily true. Because if you can come up with some examples of it disenfranchising voters and voters not showing up because of that one fact, I still don't necessarily think that it's that wise of a law or a restriction to have for voting. And it definitely can lead to racial. But we will have to see on that. And I definitely have some articles later suggesting that that is the case for voter ID laws. Okay. So I got down here in Texas, and this is comparing other states from Texas, and it has a map at the top talking about voter ID laws and what states have photo identification, what states require some form of ID, what states don't, all of those factoids. But we'll start from our first point here. Texas here, the requirements are: existing law requires voters to show either a voter registration certificate or one of the following items of ID: driver's license, Department of Public Safety ID card, any photo ID that establishes the person identity, a birth certificate, U.S. citizenship papers, U.S. passport, a copy of a current utility bill, bank statement, government check, paycheck, or other government IDs, a piece of governmental mail, any other form of ID, blah 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 blah. Awaiting U.S. Department of Justice approval, says voters of driver's license, identification card, Department of Public Safety personal ID, U.S. military ID, U.S. citizenship certificate, U.S. passport, and concealed weapon permit. So that would be if the law would be passed, and we know that the law ultimately did get passed, and it was voted in the 2014 election, but not ultimately, it didn't ultimately keep for the elections following after that. And we're going to go up to the map here where it shows the things in yellow require some form of state voter ID, and the ones in not yellow don't require some form of a voter ID. Just out of curiosity, I clicked on California and it did not take me to California, so we'll go back up and go to California ourselves here. What? Why is it doing that? Hang on 1 second here. California. No state passed voter ID in effect. First-time voters will need to show a current and valid photo ID or bank statement, utility bill, or government document with a name and address. In addition, absentee voters must submit one of those along with their ballot. So that's it. That's pretty much it there. So I thought that was rather interesting, but not ultimately something new necessarily. I just thought it would be interesting to see this graphic of the states that do require some form of identification when voting, not necessarily a photo ID identification, because that's ultimately the main concern for these IDs because of the cost that comes with a driver's license or a passport or any government issued ID where there are photos ultimately involved. Okay, we can exit out here. So this is the first case that was getting talked about on the Fifth Circuit of Appeals Court. That was the third question, really, when going back to the prompt and what I'm ultimately going to have to talk about here for my paper. And this was VC versus Abbott. Abbott being the governor that Texas has now, and the governor that replaced Rick Perry for the Texas governor, obviously. Okay. Ooh. Vassie versus Abbott, number 14, blah, 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 blah. Currently before an en bloc panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit concerns a challenge to Texas Senate Bill 14. The state voter ID law, SB 14, requires all Texan voters to show one form of voter ID in order to vote, places strict limitations on whom is exempt, and requires voters to disclose personal information to obtain a free voter ID. Plaintiffs and interviewees responding to a wide array of interest brought for 4 separate lawsuits challenging the law as an unconstitutional burden on the right to vote, a violation of the Voting Rights Act, prohibition on laws with discriminatory purpose or effect, and an unconstitutional poll tax. The lower court found in favor of the plaintiff on all 4 claims, and Texas appealed. A Fifth Circuit panel opinion vacated and recommended the lower court's conclusion that Texas legislature enacted SB 14 with discriminatory purpose, affirmed the lower court's holding that SB 14 has a discriminatory effect, vacated the lower court's conclusion that SB 14 constituted a poll tax, and rendered judgment in favor of Texas. It dismissed the plaintiff's unconstitutional burden claims under constitutional evidence. The Fifth Circuit then granted an en bloc rehearing. So that was the summary of ultimately what happened for the case here. Not that that was ultimately too surprising. Let's get these on here real quick. So there are 3 claims they brought it right here. We're going to copy and paste this down into our document real quickly. Because these are their 3 claims. With SB 14 violates the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. In Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, because SB 14 was enacted with a racially discriminatory purpose and has a racially discriminatory effect. SB 14 places a substantive burden on the fundamental right to vote under the 1st and 14th amendments, academics. SB 14 constitutes a poll tax under the 14th and 24th Amendments. Yeah, I don't know if you could say the elections are necessarily rigged or not, but there's definitely some sort of consideration for talking about that or not, but I don't know. Hard to tell ultimately, and especially with the last election. It was a very odd one, to say the least on that. Get a better hat. I wish that was the case. Usually I have my hair all nicely done for these streams, but it was a Monday and I wasn't really feeling ultimately too concerned about that. I'm a college student, so I mean, all the school is online. I'm at the school. I actually have one class in person right now. I had 2 classes in person, I guess you could say, because one of them was a hybrid, but I don't know if you ultimately count a hybrid or not. I don't really count it. So only really have had 1 class in person for this semester, because most of the classes are online, even though I am at the college campus itself, so I don't know. Hopefully all that changes by the next semester. Lower coin or not? Boom. The strictest. Yeah, okay. Don't go this. This is a big one. I copied this, I think, if I remember to do that. Where did I see that? Oops. Put that back. Highlight this. Go back over here. Based on expert testimony, the court concluded over 600,000 registered voters, 4.5% of the registered voters qualified SB 14 IDs, and over 530,000 voters do not qualify for disability exemption. In addition, a disproportionate number of African Americans and Hispanics populate that group of potentially disenfranchised voters. After reviewing the evidence presented during trial, the court analyzed each of the 4 separate legal claims brought by parties. We'll read those claims. Constitutional burden on the right to vote in violation of the First and 14th. We'll just copy and paste these. So you can have it in one place. Back for our research. First, the court found that SB 14 places an unconstitutional burden on the right to vote in violation of the First and 14th Amendments. An individual's right to vote is implied by the First Amendment and preceded as a fundamental right by dual process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. An equal protection challenge applies either when a state classifies voters in disparate ways or places restrictions on the right to vote. There are 3 tests to determine. We're not really talking about this election previously. As I was mentioning at the start, this is talking about a Texas law that got passed in 2012 and then got overturned in 2016 by the 5th Courts of Appeals. And ultimately, I have to answer the question if voter ID laws or voter identification should be allowed at the polling places for Texas in particular. We're not really talking about the national election's sake much in this paper because this is a Texas government class. So there definitely is that. But so ultimately, it's all about that one's there. Which is kind of funny because those who are outside of Texas, I think it's kind of funny to hear people talking about Texas government and that we are required to take Texas government classes. I just find that a little bit funny because Texas is definitely very proud of its heritage or its history or its just Texian of its nature. So it's funny that we are required to take a certain number of hours of Texas history and Texas government and whatnot. I find that a little bit funny. Guess we'll keep reading here. There are 3 tests to determine whether a burden on the right to vote is unconstitutional. First, if the burden is severe and completely strips the individuals of her ability to vote, then the standard is strict scrutiny. The court must determine whether the restriction is narrowly drawn to advance a state interest or compelling importance. Second, if the burden is minimal, then the standards is rational bias. Third, if the burden is substantial but not severe, as in this case, then the standard is Anderson versus Burbrick balancing test. And then it goes on to, I assume, state the test here. Whether the state's interest, including detecting and preventing voter fraud, prevention, non-citizen voting, and fostering public confidence in election integrity, justify the specific burdens that are imposed on voters who are required to produce one of the limited SB 14 qualified voter IDs in order to vote in person at the polls. Particularly the court balance the state's interest against the burden of the subgroup of Texas voters who do not possess an SB 14 qualified ID. This is gonna be a interesting article to write for sure. Let's check something real quick. And we got a good old ad for us, so yay. Oh, I forgot to do my bed. That's bad. I'm so tired. We got a vacuum. I'm just gonna go ahead and mute the mic here a little bit. this is a lot of reading. I need to change the description on these. Alright, let's move on again. Alrighty, looks like the vacuum has stopped, so we can continue on with our next part. Texas voter ID law is discriminatory and must change court rules. Texas strain voter identification law has a discriminatory impact that breaches U.S. voting rights, a federal appeals court ruled on Wednesday. The decision eerie for campaigners who argue that its voter ID requirements amount to voter suppression in violation of the Voting Rights Act. A notoriously conservative Fifth Courts of Appeal court ordered that at least some changes to limit the bill's discriminatory effect before the November general election. But the extent of those changes is unclear. As the presidential election looms, the court sent the case back to district courts to figure out a compromise solution before November that will lessen the bill's unfair consequences while respecting the Texas legislature's authority. It also asked the court to re-examine whether the law has a discriminatory intent. But the extent of those changes is unclear, the record shows. I'm just not feeling it. Let's just go to 5. You can do this. So the record shows a number of Republican-led states have introduced tougher voting laws in recent years. I think I'm actually going to call this stream here. I might stream a little bit later over the same topic. If not, it'll be tomorrow. I'm just getting a little bit too hungry think we're just going to take a break. So I might be back. If not, you can definitely catch the Red and Ed show. That's going to be on Jay Egger's YouTube channel. And they're going to be talking about politics and what happened over last week and give all their opinions on it and everything. So I'm going to have to cut this one short. But